David Parker Ray, also known as the Toy Box Killer, is one of the most disturbing and terrifying figures in true crime history. A man who appeared to lead an ordinary life as a mechanic in Elephant Butte, New Mexico, hid an unspeakable darkness behind his seemingly normal exterior. Throughout the 1990s, he systematically abducted, tortured, and abused women in ways that defy the human imagination, using a mobile torture chamber known as the Toy Box. But how did a man who blended into society become the orchestrator of such unspeakable horrors? Ray's infamy is tied to his chilling creation, the Toy Box. This wasn't a toy box in the traditional sense. It was a soundproof trailer hidden in the desolate desert, designed specifically for the sole purpose of inflicting pain. Inside, Ray had equipped the space with all manner of horrifying tools and devices, including shackles, chains, surgical instruments, and bizarre contraptions designed to restrain and hurt his victims. The trailer was isolated from the outside world, creating a nightmare scenario where no one could hear the screams of Ray's victims. But what made this horror even more insidious was Ray's use of tapes, recordings he had carefully created and played for his victims while they were trapped inside the toy box. The tapes were not just random rants. They were meticulously crafted to break down his victims mentally and physically. The voice on the recordings, Ray's own, described in graphic, clinical detail the torture they would endure. The victims were not just assaulted physically. They were psychologically tortured by the cold, methodical voice that walked them through the steps of their abuse. David Parker Ray's victims were often abducted in the middle of the night, drugged, and brought to the toy box while unconscious. Many of them were taken from remote areas, lured in with promises of a ride or other forms of manipulation. Once in the trailer, they were shackled and restrained. Some women were held for days, even weeks, as Ray and his accomplices carried out unspeakable acts of abuse. One of the most chilling aspects of Ray's crimes was his ability to remain undetected for years. He didn't just rely on physical means to control his victims. He also used psychological manipulation to silence them. He would often tell them that no one would believe them if they tried to escape or report the crimes. Ray used his charm and manipulative tactics to make them feel helpless, breaking their spirits before the abuse even began. Ray did not operate alone. His girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, played a significant role in the abductions, torture, and abuse of the victims. Hendy assisted Ray in luring women into his trap, helping to subdue them, and sometimes even participating in the abuse. Together, they created a horrific operation that spanned over several years, preying on vulnerable women who were often living on the fringes of society. They would abduct women from truck stops, bars, and other isolated locations, and Ray would record these abductions on tape to ensure that he had complete control over his victims. Despite the gruesome nature of Ray's crimes, it wasn't until one of his victims, Cynthia Vigil, managed to escape that authorities were able to expose the full extent of his depravity. In 1999, Cynthia, after enduring days of torture, managed to break free from the shackles that held her in the toy box. Severely beaten, bloodied, and traumatized, she stumbled through the desert until she found help. Her bravery and quick thinking led law enforcement to Ray's hideout, and the full scope of his crimes came to light. When authorities raided the toy box, they found a scene of unspeakable horror. It was evident that Ray had been preparing for these crimes for years, building a carefully crafted environment to carry out his twisted experiments on his victims. In addition to the horrifying physical evidence, investigators found Ray's tapes, recordings in which he detailed in chilling, calm tones the torture he planned for his victims. These tapes were played to his victims while they were subjected to abuse, deepening their fear and disorientation. The recordings were a psychological weapon, making the torment even more unbearable. David Parker Ray's reign of terror didn't end with Cynthia Vigil's escape. As law enforcement investigated, they discovered more victims, some who had been left for dead in the desert, others who had been taken and released in a state of shock and trauma. Ray's victims were often found abandoned in remote areas, barely alive, and with little to no memory of what had happened. Many of these women were so traumatized that they couldn't speak out against their captor. Some of them likely disappeared without a trace, and their fates remain a mystery. Ray's capture was a breakthrough for investigators, but even after his arrest, the full extent of his crimes remained unclear. He was charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, rape, and torture, but he was never convicted of murder, though authorities believe there were likely more victims whose bodies were never found. Ray's trial revealed the depth of his depravity, with accounts from his surviving victims detailing the psychological and physical torment they endured. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, Ray never fully confessed to the extent of his crimes. He maintained that his victims were willing participants and that his actions were part of some twisted sexual fantasy. Ray was sentenced to over 200 years in prison, but died in 2002, just a few years into his sentence. His death left many questions unanswered, and his victims will never have the closure they deserve. David Parker Ray's toy box remains one of the darkest and most chilling criminal cases in history. The legacy of his crimes lives on, not only in the survivors who still bear the scars of his abuse, but in the terrifying reminder that evil can lurk behind even the most ordinary facades. Ray's case serves as a haunting warning of the depths of human cruelty and the dangers of underestimating the darkness that can exist in seemingly innocent people. If you found this story disturbing, make sure to subscribe to MMM for more true crime content, where we explore the darkest corners of criminal history. Don't forget to like, share, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on our latest videos.